I rise to speak on an amendment that's offered by the senior senator from North Carolina, and it's an amendment that would change the formula for how Title I funds are allocated among the states. So first, by way of background, Mr. President, the Title I is the largest category of federal financial assistance for K through 12 education. So we're talking about a large pot of money. This is the biggest single source of federal funding for primary and secondary education. And under current law, the formula for how that money is allocated to the school districts is based really on two things. It's based on the number of children who live in poverty in these respective districts, but it's also related to the average amount that the various states spend on education. So let me be very clear. It is not a single uniform amount per student. It was never meant to be. It still is not. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that it is meant, this correlation to not only the number of kids in poverty, but also the amount of money that states spend on education, is designed that way in order to reflect the fact that there are different costs of living in different states. Nobody would dispute that, I don't think. Some states, the real estate on which you build a school is more expensive. Some states have a higher general wage level, and so teachers get paid more. States just have different expenses. And in addition, there's an incentive element here. The incentive is for states that are willing to commit more resources, and that means taxing their residents more to fund education. Then there's that little bit more that comes from the federal government. So this is a finite amount of money. And what this amendment goes to is the question of how does this get allocated. The amendment originally offered by the senior senator from North Carolina was very troubling to me because it would profoundly change the formula effective immediately. And this is a zero-sum game. And so some states would win a lot, other states would lose a lot. Pennsylvania stood to lose a lot of funding under the formulation that was originally constructed for this amendment. The gist of it being to convert the funding to an almost uniform amount per student. I can assure you I was hearing loud and clearly from the folks who run especially the large school districts in Pennsylvania about how concerned they were, because it was multi-million-dollar per year hit that they were going to take. I spoke with Dr. Height, who's the superintendent of Philadelphia schools, and Dr. Lane from the Pittsburgh School District, as they would have been hit the hardest in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In total, had the original amendment become law, it would have cost Pennsylvania over $120 million per year. And every one of Pennsylvania's 500 school districts, except one, would have lost money. So 499 school districts would have had to do with less, and one would have had a little bit more. Many of them would have lost huge amounts of their funding. So I want to first say I appreciate the fact that the senator from North Carolina and other senators worked with my office and other offices across the aisle to take a different approach. And so the original amendment is no longer under consideration. My understanding is the unanimous consent agreement, which was struck earlier, abandons that approach. But it does still have an element of that direction that does concern me, and I want to touch on that. So here's my understanding. Under the form that the amendment now takes, and which we will be voting on maybe later today, the current levels of funding will continue under the current formula. And in fact, that funding level, as it naturally tends to grow each year because the federal government increases funding on this, for a while, that growth will also occur according to the current formulation. But at some point in the not too distant future, the total spending on Title I funding will reach about $17 billion. It's about 14.5, gets to 17. And from that point forward, prospectively, the increments each year will then be allocated according to the new formula, which is by the design, the same design as the original amendment, which is nearly uniform spending per child, disregarding, in my view, the important consideration of the different costs of living in the various states. So this is a huge improvement from my point of view over what we were looking at before. Pennsylvania will not have a dime cut from its spending. And the formula doesn't change next year or the year after, and I'm not sure exactly when we'll reach that $17 billion figure. But at some point, if this amendment passes, this reformulated amendment from the senior senator from North Carolina, if it does pass, then at some point we start to move incremental funding into this sort of uniform formulation rather than the current formulation where we take into account the varying costs of education. So while this is a huge improvement over the original version of this amendment, it is still something that I think is very problematic, and so I will be voting no on this. I would just summarize, Mr. President, by saying that I think the amendment is mistaken in two respects. One is fundamentally fails to recognize the varying costs of living in the varying states, and that's a very, very big difference. And secondly, it really penalizes those states that are willing to ask their citizens to invest more in education by eliminating the current mechanism. So I would urge my colleagues to vote no on that amendment, and with that, I yield the floor.